Okay, maybe can how, I don't know, can we turn off that joining ping? Someone texted. I'm sorry. No, now I'm confused. All right. So, hello, I'm Matthew Shapiro, professor of political science in the Department of Social Sciences here at IIT. And thank you for joining us for this week's seminar about great minds, great problems. Great problems, great minds. One and the same. Every week we have speakers come and we invite some of the paramount thinkers in their respective fields to share their insights about topics that are deemed to be of great significance on many different levels, locally, nationally, and internationally. So today we have the latter case, the last of those three cases, presenting Dr. Kyung Sun, or K if you get to know him on a first name basis, who is visiting us from Korea right now. It is very early in the morning. It's rolling on 3 a.m. there. And I feel terrible for having asked him to speak, but I really wanted him to because I knew that his topic was of significance for us at IIT. Let me give you some information about Professor Sun. He is a professor at the Asiatic Research Institute, which is at Korea University. He has served as a lecturer at the School of East Asian Studies at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and also served as an associate professor at the School of Law at Tohoku University in Sendai, Japan. His recent publications include Order Wars and Floating Balance, and he published that with Andreas Herberg Roth. And he also wrote Multi-Hegemony, Sutured Regionness, and the U.S.-China-Japan Triangle. So there's a lot of focus for Professor Son in terms of the Northeast Asian region, as well as the Northeast Asian's region connections with the United States. In other publications, he's written something in the Japanese Journal of Political Science, Middle Powers and the Rise of China. And he wrote a volume called China's Rise and Regional Integration in East Asia, Hegemony or Community, published with Routledge. And for that, he was co-editing it. And then finally, he has written in Chinese Journal of International Politics, Harmony, the Supremacy of Human Agency, and East Asia's Mega Discourses for Governance. So there are many different subjects about which Professor Sun is going to discuss with us. But today he'll be targeting something specifically related to semiconductors and trade relations in Northeast Asia. I don't want to go into it anymore. I'll turn it over now to you, Professor Sun, and thank you again for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. It's a really great privilege to be here. And also, thank you very much for such a long, detailed introduction of my research achievement. And anyway, I'm not sure about who is really attending this event, but I really appreciate your presence here. And also, after my presentation, I invite you guys to make some comments and questions. Okay, then let me share the screen first.
Oh, while you're doing that, I forgot to remind everyone, if you do have questions, you're free to put them into the comments box and I can look them over and then Professor Sun can share his responses at the end. And also, this whole presentation is being recorded.
Okay. The title of my presentation is A Weapon War, a Default Option, Nationalism, Weaponized Interdependence, and South Korea's Strategies for Mutual Prosperity in East Asia. Actually, before starting my PPT presentation, let me share a brief YouTube video. Okay, this is a famous professional wrestling skill called choke slam, and the famous wrestler Undertaker is using this choke slam technique. Actually, he's just grab the neck of his opponent and lift him and eventually slam him to the floor. The reason why I'm actually displaying this video here is basically what many nations in this 21st century are doing. It's just like this choke slam technique. Basically, they are targeting the weakness of their opponents or their rival countries, and using their actually structured power and influence, they are prone to basically impose some heavy, punitive actions against some countries. So somehow this sounds like a struggle of all against all in a jungle. And actually, that's what's happening on the surface. But what I'm going to tell you in this seminar is actually there is a very much strong resilience of global economic interdependence system. So I'm not sure you are sharing my PPT slide.
No,
Matt?
you have to go back to the box on the bottom and
Okay.
click present.
Okay. Just a second. So now I'm back, and actually globalization and economic interdependence creates international asymmetry in power and influences. In other words, states that rely on particular goods or technologies from another state and like substitute suppliers are vulnerable to shocks or manipulations. So in East Asia, the weaponization of interdependence is not a rarity. It has been deployed frequently in many cases. First, in 2010, China restricted the export of rare earths to Japan. Rare earth is a key ingredient for the production of semiconductor products. And China launched this economic sanctions against Japan when the two countries clashed over territorial dispute surrounding the Senkaku Diaoyu islets in the East China Sea. And how come China could use this tactic? Simply because China accounts for almost 97% of global production of rare earths. So it has enjoyed a really predominant position in global trade of rare earths. And also in 2016, when the United States and South Korea decided to deploy terminal high altitude area defense, THAAD missile defense system in South Korea, China sanctioned South Korean firms, including Lotte, the conglomerate that had offered land to allow for the deployment of missile system, as well as banning Chinese tours to South Korea. According to a report by Hyundai Research Institute, Korean companies would suffer from a loss of 8.5 trillion won. That is about 7.1 billion US dollars in 2017 alone due to China's economic retaliation. In particular, the loss in the tourism sector was estimated at 7.1 trillion won loss. It's almost 6.3 billion US dollars. So basically, this Chinese action caused really serious trouble in South Korean economy, especially in the tourism industry, which is highly dependent on Chinese tourists. And then in 2019, there was a Korea-Japan dispute over the export control of key materials used for semiconductor and display production. This is actually the case study in this paper. So let's look at the global transition first. We often say American hegemony is over. Whether you agree with this idea or not, America is not like America 20 years ago, right after the end of the Cold War. At that time, United States really enjoyed a hegemonic position in international relations. It has been always preaching democracy and market economy, and also it tried to create liberal international order. But the problem is, in the third decade of 21st century, we can say America has lost its hegemony, even though it is still wielding enormous and dominant power in economy, in security and military issues. But still, we don't often describe this as a form of hegemony. So this is just somehow, still we can say United States enjoys some form of leadership or supremacy. And with the almost end of American hegemony, the process of globalization and liberal international order has been also very much weakened. What is the evidence of this? If you look at the case of how WTO, World Trade Organization, is functioning, actually it has become very much dysfunctional. If it is functioning in a proper way, how come United States could impose such large, tariffs against Chinese products? And how can, for example, as I mentioned in the East Asian cases, how can China impose, such control over export of rare earths to Japan? So if you remember what President Trump did during his tenure, especially when he refused to appoint a judge for WTO's dispute settlement panel, we can obviously say WTO has become very much dysfunctional, and it is a clear testament to the declining liberal international order, which actually was built by the United States. And also, why is American hegemony declining? It's because the rise of China and India, and also resurgence of Russia. So basically what we see here and now is basically new world order or disorder. So the process of globalization and legacy of liberal international order are still very strong, but we see the rise of nationalism and geopolitics combining trade with national security considerations. So when we saw the rise of nationalism in the early 20th century, we suffered from two world wars. However, 21st century weapon of the nationalist is weaponized interdependence. And their top skill is to find the choke point of enemies or rivals. However, my research question here is whether this weaponization is really effective. Actually, what I'm saying in this paper is basically this weaponization is not really effective, but it is actually contributing to the aggravation of bilateral diplomatic ties of the countries concerned. So let's look at some survey first. A survey commissioned by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs was conducted in March 24 and 28, 2021 in South Korea among a representative national sample of 1,000 adults. 83% say China is more of a security threat, with just 12% saying it is more of a security partner. On a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the most favorable, China had a mean score of 3.6, on par with North Korea with a 3.5 and Japan with a 3.7. So can you believe it? Because you know the still lingering and problem and animosity between South and North Korea as a divided nations, and also because of Japan's colonial rule, we can say South Koreans still keep high-level anti-Japanese sentiment. But basically, China is hated by Koreans on the same level. And the corresponding figure for the United States stood at 6.4. That means almost, double. So in the same poll 2 years ago, China scored 4.8. That means because of recent bilateral problems, Koreans started keeping, higher level of, antipathy against China. Furthermore, anti-Japanese sentiment has sharply risen in Korea in 2019, right after Japan announced export restrictions on semiconductor products. And an estimated of 50,000 retail shops in Seoul pledged to join a campaign to boycott Japanese products such as beer. So what I would like to say here is that the weaponization of interdependence is just self-destructive and mutually destructive. We need to conceive a better way of governing our international economic life. So in this paper, I'm first looking at war and nationalism, and then I will offer some definitions of semiconductor nationalism or techno nationalism. And as a case study, I will look at trade war between Korea and Japan over semiconductor issues since 2019. And finally, I will propose the creation of an East Asian semiconductor community, EASC, like the European Korean steel community, as one option for preventing the supply chain disturbances and promoting East Asian integration. However, I should say at the outset that EASC is an ideal type as a form of complex interdependence, and it is not really attainable shortly because there is no able agency and favorable structure compared with the ECSC. In economic realities, however, I will show that there is already high-level economic interdependence among Korea, Japan, and other East Asian countries. So, when we are talking about international political economy, we often encounter the definition of uh, complex interdependence. Keohane actually developed the notion of complex interdependence, a form of a fragmented polity in which there were multiple actors, multiple issues that were not necessarily hierarchically ordered, and force and the threat of force were not valuable tools of policy. And Keohane nevertheless portrayed both complex interdependence and realism as ideal types, and the realities unfolding are somewhere in between, depending on regions and issue areas. And war, because we are talking about weaponized interdependence, it's in a sense important to define war first. When we are talking about definition of a war, the person who comes first to our mind is actually Karl von Clausewitz, who is a very much famous Prussian general and war theorist. He's famously known for his definition of war as the continuation of policy by other means. But he addressed solely the armed conflicts of nation state after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. By contrast, Brooks argues that there is no boundary between peace and war, and globalization has created a world in which everything became war against the enemies, changing constantly. In other words, war has lost a sense of temporality and speciality because it is taking place all the time everywhere. For example, US military personnel do not just kill people, but also train Afghan judges and patrol for pilots. So somehow, war has become just an endless state of life for countries like United States. And myself also coined the term, for example, order war, to refer to Sino-American hegemonic competition, among others, in which the two great powers are all out to establish new regional or global order in their own images and preferences in the aftermath of the decline of Western liberal order. And the third decade of the 21st century is marked by the resurgence of nationalism, as many international trade issues have been politicized and even securitized to the extent that many governments have weaponized their structural advantages for coercive use against the targeted state. In this world where unprecedented levels of interdependence are combined with the nationalist or hegemonic struggles, many states are prone to employ all measures short of war. Actually, this is important. All measures short of war means still, even though we are living in a state of struggle of all against all, we have made some improvement. We have become slightly more enlightened, as time goes by. So many, you can say, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, great powers clashed with weapons, killing each other. But now, somehow, they are prone to employ some mostly economic measures. So trade war is one form. So therefore, I think, I believe in the progression of humanity, but still we have many things to improve still. And let me briefly define the techno nationalism and semiconductor nationalism. Undying even in the age of globalization, nationalism has permeated the economic warfare between nation states in the 21st century. The production of semiconductors, the basic components of modern digital life used for everything from artificial intelligence to smartphones, has become the most important industry, with a total sales volume amounting to 400 billion US dollars in 2019. since they are known as building blocks for future innovation and perhaps one of the key variables determining the fate of current hegemonic struggles between United States and China, as well as competition of major industrial powers, including European Union, Japan, South Korea. Semiconductors emerged as one of the key national security issues. Therefore, the securitization of semiconductor manufacturing and sales led to government intervention in business decisions over where to manufacture chips and to whom to sell them. As more and more countries became concerned with the security of digital infrastructure such as 5G and supply chains, techno nationalism or semiconductor nationalism gained traction across the world. If you look at this figure, it shows the global chip industries. Actually, they are divided into United States and Asia, and then Europe. Basically, in the United States, you see the large companies like Intel, the familiar ones like Nvidia, Qualcomm, and Micron as well. In Asia, Samsung and TSMC from Taiwan are the biggest ones. And also, there's Tokyo Electron. And also there are some important, European companies as well. So we can say there is a kind of a division of role, or maybe quite strong interdependence among many, enterprises involved in this sector. So now let's move to the main case study, which is Japan and South Korea, dispute. Actually, it was first caused by the South Korean Supreme Court ruling, in which it ordered Nippon Steel, a Japanese company, to repay 100 million won, almost 84,000 US dollars in World War II era deaths, each to 4 Korean forced laborers for the first time in history. The ruling allowed for the seizure of Nippon Steel assets, starting the procedure to auction off the Japanese firm's shares in a Korea-based venture with POSCO. Still, the process is going on. Somehow, the real auctioning off the Japanese firm's share will cause potentially greater diplomatic issues. Actually, I think the South Korean government is relatively slowing the process of applying this measure. So still, South Korea is still in the middle of, in a sense, undertaking the procedures to auction off the Japanese firm's shares. And Japan insisted that it had already paid them off in a 1965 Treaty of Diplomatic Normalization. And this dispute plunged bilateral relations to their lowest level in decades. So, after this, the trade war started in July 2019, when Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry imposed restrictions on the export of 3 key high-tech materials Japan has dominated globally: high purity hydrogen fluoride, also called etching gas, and photoresist, and fluorinated polyimide. So these are really key materials used for the production of semiconductor and also smartphone displays as well. And in August, Japan has undertaken additional measures by downgrading South Korea from its white list of preferred trading partners, forcing Japanese exports of technology-related goods to go through extra screening for each contract. Nevertheless, Japanese government approved the shipments of photoresist to Samsung twice in August 2019, prior to a meeting in Beijing between Japan's Foreign Minister Taro Kono and his South Korean counterpart Kang Kyung-hwa. And South Korean companies such as Samsung and SK Hynix that control more than half of the global market in memory chips used for smartphones and vehicles have been highly dependent on their imports of key materials from Japan. It could be rather described as a form of interdependence given the linkages between the industries of the two countries. In January to July 2019 period, Korea's import of photoresist and fluorinated polyimide and etching gas from Japan accounted for 92%, 93%, and 41% of its total imports, respectively, while Korea imported 11% of photoresist, 38% of fluorinated polyimide, and 85% of etching gas produced in Japan. So we can see a very strong interdependence between the two countries. And let's look at what Japan did at the time. In a reversal of earlier policy of granting 3-year bulk permit, Japanese exporters have been instructed to gain government permission for each shipment, which takes around 90 days. And Japan's export control could have inflicted devastating damage to Korean companies. In particular, Japanese government, aware of Korean industry's weaknesses, has chosen, among others, extreme ultraviolet photoresist and other export items which cannot easily be replaced by other, sources. It's Japanese government intended to deploy choke point effect here. And actually, this photoresist is a key material used for photolithography, a process of printing rough sketch of a circuit onto a wafer using light. According to industrial sources, photoresist stocks in Korea could last only 1 month if there were no imports from Japan. And obviously, South Korea faced the Japanese sanctions. It just didn't remain very idle. It made a counterattack in the form of, threatening to nullify GSOMIA. GSOMIA is a military information sharing agreement between Japan and South Korea. Actually, South Korea has been very much reluctant to enter into any forms of security relationship with Japan because of the legacy of colonial rule. But South Korea agreed to sign this because of the pressure of the United States. But anyway, what has happened here is basically South Korea reversed its earlier decision and decided to suspend the expiration under the condition that GSOMIA could be terminated at any moment. That means even though South Korea actually tried to retaliate Japan's action, basically United States intervened to keep this GSOMIA agreement intact because it is basically one big pillar of America's security design is in East Asia. United States has been always pressing Korea and Japan to keep very much friendly ties. Somehow, their virtual alliance is one of the main pillars sustaining what we can say, containment policy of China by the United States. And at that time, actually, in the face of Japanese sanctions, Korea faced many, many different options. So South Korean companies consider diversifying the import sources of Japanese materials and purchasing them from Russia or Chinese companies already offering to provide them. However, problem is they couldn't meet the expectations, technological expectations of South Korean companies. So that means Japan really produced state of the art uh, materials in this sector. And to dodge the export control, there were several options available to South Korean companies back in 2019. South Korean companies tried to import them via their overseas plants to strengthen their export control. However, the Japanese government prevented a detour export of these items by identifying their end users. Second, Samsung and SK Hynix tried to purchase etching gas from Japanese plants in Taiwan and Singapore, but Japanese government intervened to block this attempt as well. Third, long-term option has been to accommodate Japan's production bases in South Korea, an option appearing unplausible at first because of Japanese government's restrictions. Therefore, the industrial outlook has been gloomy at that time with the stocks of these materials running out rapidly. However, 1 year after Japan's action, a sense of crisis in South Korean semiconductor industries have evaporated in less than a year in 2020. And actually, because time is running out quite quickly, I don't have much time left. So I will skip some slide and go to the conclusion part. So basically, South Korean government offered a lot of subsidies to South Korean industries, and also, many South Korean companies succeeded in localization of these materials, substituting Japanese imports. And as a result of success in localization and diversification, somehow Korea's import of etching gas from Japan slid 85% during the period between January and May 2020. So obviously, South Korea succeeded in diversification and localization of these materials. And 2 years after Japan's sanction, one notable thing is some Japanese companies actually made an investment in South Korea, establishing factories there. So somehow, this direct investment in South Korea helped South Korea to obtain necessary materials. But many Japanese newspapers, including Nikkei, argued that this might lead to Japan's industrial hollowing out and even a decrease of Japanese employment. And I made some, summary of what has happened in these three key materials, but I don't have enough time, to mention. But one important figure here is, for example, the share of imports from Japan in etching gas decreased from almost 44% in 2019 to 12% in 2020 and 13% in this year. So this is a quite remarkable, almost more than 80% decrease. Whereas the other, photoresist and fluorinated polyimide, the level of Korea's import from Japan remained quite steady. So that means, in a sense, we can say this this Japan's action at first was regarded as great threat to South Korean industries, but somehow in reality, Japanese government allowed some export of these materials to South Korea on a case by case. Therefore, in just 1 year after the imposition of sanctions, South Korea somehow, um, secured quite sustainable supplies of these materials because they have some of them. I mean, some companies have locally produced these materials, or they imported these materials from European sources. So I will skip this part. So what I'm saying here is the trade war caused actually massive spending of Korean taxpayers' money and also temporary sales loss of Korean and Japanese semiconductor companies. So there's some Japanese companies are suffering from the plunging stock prices, and therefore many South Korean experts, including Donghi University professor, said close cooperation with Japan is not an option but a necessity for Korea's material parts and equipment industries to secure global competitive edge. And finally, I am somehow, trying to conceive what I call East Asian semiconductor community, which is actually uh, named after European steel, Korean steel community. As you know, European Korean steel community has been successfully established and eventually became European Union. And I try to apply the same process to the process of East Asian economic, possibly political integration. So if maybe Korea, Japan, Taiwan could intensify their cooperation in this semiconductor sector, perhaps it could be a prototype community emerging in Northeast Asia. But frankly speaking, this is not feasible at the moment because of the high level, animosity between Japan and Korea because of the history issues, including forced labor and comfort women issues. But still, the title of this seminar series is Great Minds and Great Problems. And we need a very much innovative ideas to improve our relations for our really mutual prosperity. And again, what I'm saying in this paper is already there is a very high level economic interdependence between East Asian countries. For example, the large foundry in Taiwan, TSMC, for example, will build a research and development facility in Tsukuba, Ibaraki Prefecture, Japan, to develop leading edge microchip technology. So Japan's actually government is heavily subsidizing the establishment of this factory. And we can say there are many efforts somehow to maintain, business cooperation in this part of the world, but somehow, there is a relatively high level of political animosity among the countries involved. So anyway, in this paper, I will try to conclude my discussion by arguing that somehow, structured economic interdependence has shown resilience against the government intervention undertaken in the form of a weaponizing interdependence. And clearly this Korea-Japan case showed the limitedness of semiconductor nationalism. Therefore, all in all, I think it's time to think about some bold idea of intensifying East Asian economic integration, because somehow, this kind of trade war is, as I said, self-destructive or mutually destructive. It's always disturbing, global or local, regional supply chain, and it is also causing a lot of problems, to domestic production of key materials. Therefore, somehow we politicians or diplomats need to work hard to create some lasting international structure for, mutual prosperity. Anyway, I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Son. That was excellent and very informative. I have to speak on behalf of many of the people in the audience that you kept saying, as you know, we don't know. So you're letting us know a lot of this information, the importance of semiconductor foundries in Northeast Asia, the role it plays in the international economy, the international relations problems in Northeast Asia, particularly because of Japanese colonial history. I think a lot of people are very unfamiliar with that, but thank you for highlighting all of those points and just connecting what's gone on in the last couple of years with what happened 100 years ago. So what I want to do now is open up the floor for questions, if there are any. You can put the question into the chat. You can also put comments like we just saw, or, well, here we go. Jeff Terry is asking, what role has the pandemic played in exacerbating some of the divisions that you were just talking about?
We can say the pandemic is not really affecting the current rivalries or the economic life of East Asian countries. Somehow, they are, as you can see, the growth rate of China and other countries, they are quickly recovering from the crisis of a pandemic, and therefore somehow the pandemic, even though it is affecting a lot our daily lives, it is not really affecting business life or industrial life of East Asians.
I think just to piggyback on what Professor Terry asked, maybe in the context of what we saw in the United States, where there was a lot of blaming of China for the problem of the pandemic, that it started there. Was there any sort of impact of that narrative in Korea or in Japan? Would that play a
role? At least in Korea, we don't often talk about, the problem of China as the source of this pandemic. Basically, if you look at the case of Australia, China-Australia relations were strained very much because Australian government called for basically international investigation about the role of China in terms of starting this pandemic. But, we perhaps South Koreans are not sharing this opinion, and we don't have much discussion about this issue.
Nufal, do you have a question?
Yeah. So I was just like browsing on the web, and I saw like, for example, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They believe that the current U.S. administration would they could like work on making the relationship between Japan and South Korea much better through having long talks about all the different sensitive topics that both regard uh, as highly as highly sensitive. Do you think that the current U.S. administration will be capable at easing the tensions?
Basically, as you can imagine, United States has been trying to what we call virtual alliance among United States, Japan, and South Korea. As I mentioned in this paper, South Korea is very much reluctant to enter into a higher level of security cooperation with Japan. But still, both South Korea and Japan are very much attentive to the position of the United States. So therefore, uh, South Korea is does not intend to spill the atmosphere totally. So basically, South Korea at the moment is trying to improve relations with Japan. So somehow, they want to put an end to this trade war, and perhaps maybe in the face of the rise of China, I think there will be bigger possibility of a cooperation between Japan and South Korea eventually, which might be very much favorable to the national interest of the United States.
Thank you very much for your answer. And by the way, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really good.
Thank you very much.
No one's raising their hand, so let me ask, Professor Sun, do you see there ever being a time in the future where Japanese colonialism doesn't come into play? Will this, when it comes to the kinds of international relations discussions in Northeast Asia, I mean, just to ask a more specific question, will there be no clear coordination? Will coordination always be challenged by that historical artifact?
Yeah, actually, in this paper I mentioned able agency and favorable international structure. These are clear and very much important variables for the formation of a better international relations, as you know. So basically, if we go back, for example, the year 2000, there was I can say, able leadership or agency led by President Kim Dae-jung of South Korea and Japanese Prime Minister Keijo Obuchi. These two guys actually created an excellent South Korea-Japan partnership at that time. So somehow, we have a very much brilliant moment of bilateral cooperation in history, but it was really short-lived, and it was hijacked by the rise of, in a sense, Japanese nationalism and also South Korean nationalism after that. So in that sense, we need really able politicians who are looking beyond the current problems and stalemate. At the same time, as in the case of European community making, and if we look at how the European coal and steel community was created, basically, at that time, European countries were facing, the Western European countries were facing the rise of communism. And therefore, somehow, there was no option but to intensify cooperation amongst Western European countries. That resulted in the Franco-German cooperation, and that helped to create European coal and steel community. The problem in East Asia, we don't have the same level of threat from any country. Obviously, China is regarded as a form of threat, but compared with the threat level of Soviet expansionism back in 1950s, we still feel that China is rather a partner for cooperation.
Right. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Nufal, another question?
Yes, sorry. So, you know, if we look at the advantages, and I'm sure in your paper you surely mentioned that, if we look at the advantages and the disadvantages, and also look at the future of what's happening in Asia, and we try to show the future economic prospect of Korea and Japan in a positive manner, we will see that things would be better for both sides. But if both countries, continue to argue between each other, I think there is a lot of money that won't be made for both sides, and that money could potentially be used to defend themselves for geopolitical, for what's happening around in Asia, because we all know that at the moment there is a problem with North Korea, with China applying pressure at the South China Sea, and I believe at the moment it's best for the two nations to work together to make money and to use that money to spend on their military resources, because at the end of the day, military resources is quite needed for both countries. And so maybe by showing that to both countries that they need more money to either spend on military but also on innovations, maybe they would both find some reasons to get more along and to be partnering between each other to have a certain partnership.
Yeah, basically, I think you made a point, and what's happening in South Korea and Japan are perhaps the rising necessity of what we call self-help, especially in Japan. Basically, Japan has been limiting its defense spending to the 1% over its GDP, and perhaps according to some press reports, Japanese government is trying to spend more than 1% of its GDP on defense in the future, and also South Korea is. As you have seen some newspaper report, has rapidly modernizing its weapon system, including ballistic missiles. So basically, we can say there is a small-scale arms race in East Asia, but still, compared with the large-scale, investment and military capacity of China, these are not enough. Therefore, both South Korea and Japan are always highlighting the importance of their alliance with the United States. So somehow, U.S. armies stationed both in South Korea and Japan could be a fixture. They are really serving the role of a stabilizer or balancer in East Asia at the moment in the face of a Chinese threat.
Very good. Thank you for the questions. And on that note, we need to conclude. It is a little over time, but thank you, Professor Son, for taking the time to come and share your provocative ideas about semiconductors, about bilateral ties between South Korea and Japan. And if any of you want to reach out to Professor Sun, you can find his email address online at the Asiatic Research Institute at Korea University, or reach out to me, and I'll be happy to convey any questions you have or to reach out to Professor Sun. Can we all thank Professor Sun by conventionally we write applause or yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for
you.
coming.
Keep in
Please get
touch.
some rest, Professor Sun.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, doctor. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hao Wang, for arranging this event.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for a great presentation. Yeah, it's
Actually, I'm very much a pro-Chinese person. I don't know
actually it's
if-
just running off the time. So I think have some questions. I can send you an email later.
Okay. Okay, no problem. Please.
Yeah. Thank you for a great presentation. Yeah.
Okay, get some
Okay.
rest, Professor Sun. Thank you for coming, Kay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, Dr. Hao Huang, did you see my email? Yesterday I couldn't be here.